By the spring of 1945, the Western Netherlands had become a land slowly starving to death. The war that had thundered across Europe for nearly 6 years was finally grinding toward its end, but for millions of Dutch civilians, survival had become a daily gamble. The winter of 1944-45, later known simply as the Hunger Winter, had stripped the country bare. German occupation authorities had cut off food shipments after a Dutch railway strike aimed at supporting the Allied advance. Canals froze, transport collapsed, fuel vanished, and farms were isolated from cities. What little food remained was hoarded, traded on the black market, or consumed by occupying forces. In Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and countless smaller towns, people survived on rations that barely reached a few hundred calories a day. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Sugar beets were boiled into bitter soups. Tulip bulbs, once symbols of wealth, became a desperate source of starch. Thousands died quietly in cold apartments, their bodies too weak to fight disease or hunger. Children grew skeletal. Elderly people disappeared from streets and stairwells. Hospitals ran out of supplies and power. The war was almost over, yet death was accelerating. Across the North Sea, Allied leaders were aware of the crisis, but the situation was politically and militarily delicate. Western Holland was still under German control. The front lines had stalled, and a full-scale ground assault risked massive civilian casualties and infrastructure destruction. Yet doing nothing meant allowing starvation to continue unchecked. By April 1945, intelligence reports and resistance messages painted a grim picture. Tens of thousands could die before liberation arrived. In Allied headquarters, discussions shifted from bombing targets to feeding cities. This alone marked a radical turn. For years, heavy bombers had been instruments of devastation, their bomb bays filled with high explosives and incendiaries aimed at factories, rail yards, and urban centers. Now, those same aircraft were being considered as delivery vehicles for food. It was an idea that, just months earlier, would have seemed impossible. Negotiations began through neutral intermediaries and the Dutch resistance. British and American officials reached out to German commanders in the Netherlands, proposing a temporary truce that would allow humanitarian flights to pass unchallenged. The Germans, themselves facing imminent defeat and aware that continued starvation would only worsen post-war consequences, reluctantly agreed. They pledged not to fire on Allied aircraft flying specific routes at specified altitudes. This agreement was fragile. Nothing like it had been attempted on such a scale. Bomber crews were warned that anti-aircraft fire could still erupt at any moment, whether through miscommunication, rogue units, or simple chaos in a collapsing command structure. The skies over the Netherlands had been deadly for years. Now those same skies would test whether trust was even possible in the final days of total war. The British named their effort Operation Manna, drawing on the biblical image of food falling from heaven. The Americans called theirs Operation Chowhound, a more blunt but fitting title. Together, they represented one of the most extraordinary reversals of purpose in modern warfare. The mission was not to destroy, but to sustain. Airfields in England and on the continent sprang into frantic activity. Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force and B-17 flying fortresses of the U.S. Army Air Forces were hastily modified. Bomb racks were removed or bypassed. Instead of bombs, crews loaded sacks of flour, crates of canned food, K-rations, powdered milk, and fats anything that could be spared from military stockpiles. Some packages were wrapped in cloth or paper. Others were simply dropped loose, calculated to survive the short fall. Pilots studied maps not of enemy targets, but of drop zones near cities and fields where civilians could gather safely. Crews were briefed to fly incredibly low, sometimes as low as 200 feet, so that supplies would not scatter or be damaged. This went against everything bomber crews had been trained to do. Heavy bombers survived by altitude, speed, and formation. Flying low and slow made them vulnerable to everything from small arms fire to mechanical failure. Many of the airmen assigned to these missions had spent months or years dropping bombs on occupied Europe, including the Netherlands itself. Some had seen cities burn from thousands of feet above. Now they were returning, not as instruments of destruction, but as bearers of relief. For some crews, the emotional shift was immediate and overwhelming. Others approached the mission with cautious detachment, knowing that war had not yet officially ended. On the ground, word spread rapidly. Dutch resistance networks informed civilians of the planned drops. People were told where to gather, when to look to the skies, and how to signal the aircraft. After months of despair, rumors of food falling from Allied bombers seemed almost unreal. Many did not believe it until they heard the engines. When the first aircraft appeared over Dutch cities in late April 1945, they did not arrive at high altitude in tight combat formations. They came low, rumbling just above rooftops and treetops, engines roaring close enough to feel. Civilians poured into streets, fields, and parks. Some climbed onto rooftops despite their weakness. Others waved flags, blankets, anything they could find. People shouted, cried, prayed. Then the bomb bays opened. Instead of explosions, packages tumbled out, bouncing and breaking open on impact. Flour burst into white clouds. Food scattered across fields and streets. Parachutes blossomed briefly before collapsing. The sight defied every expectation formed during 5 years of occupation. Aircraft that once symbolized terror now delivered life. Pilots could see faces clearly from their cockpits. Some crews reported seeing people kneel. Others saw crowds chasing falling supplies despite warnings to stay clear. The risk of injury was real, but hunger overpowered caution. For many Dutch civilians, this was the first substantial food they had seen in months. The missions continued day after day. Hundreds of sorties flew precise routes across enemy-held territory. Crews trusted that German guns would remain silent. In most cases, they did. The war, in these moments, seemed to pause. But the strain was visible everywhere. Aircraft engines overheated from low-altitude flying. Crews flew without defensive formations. Navigation errors could send planes off course into still hostile areas. Each mission carried risk, not just from the enemy, but from exhaustion and the unfamiliar nature of the task. Still, the bombers kept coming. By the time April turned into May, thousands of tons of food had been delivered. The immediate famine did not end overnight, but the death rate slowed. Hospitals stabilized. Children regained strength. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical relief. The Dutch people were not forgotten. Liberation was no longer an abstract promise. It was visible, audible, and falling from the sky. For the bomber crews, the missions left a mark that would outlast the war. Many would later say that dropping food instead of bombs was the most meaningful mission they ever flew. After years of destruction, they had finally seen their aircraft used to save lives instead of end them. And yet, this extraordinary chapter of the war unfolded quietly, overshadowed by surrender documents, victory parades, and the collapse of Nazi Germany. The moment when bombers became lifelines was brief, fragile, and deeply human. The war was still not officially over. But in the skies over the Netherlands, something rare had happened. The machines built for annihilation had delivered mercy. As Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound expanded, the scale of the undertaking became clearer with every passing day. What had begun as a desperate humanitarian gamble quickly turned into one of the largest air-delivered relief efforts ever attempted during an active war. Allied planners were forced to improvise constantly. There were no manuals for feeding an occupied nation from the air, while enemy troops still stood on the ground below. The logistics alone were staggering. Food had to be sourced from already stretched military stockpiles without weakening frontline units. Flour, canned meat, fats, sugar, dried eggs, and rashes were prioritized because they could be consumed immediately or distributed efficiently by Dutch authorities once liberation came. Everything had to be packed quickly, often by ground crews who had spent years loading bombs and now found themselves handling sacks of food instead. Many described the work as surreal. The smell of flour replaced the sharp chemical tang of explosives, and bomb trolleys rattled under loads meant to save lives rather than take them. The crews who flew these missions faced an entirely different kind of danger. Heavy bombers, like the Lancaster and the B-17, were not designed for sustained low-altitude flight. Their engines ran hotter, fuel consumption increased, and any mechanical failure left little margin for recovery. Navigators had to adjust to landmarks instead of radio beacons, flying visually over cities that had once been targets. Pilots were instructed to fly straight and level during drops, a maneuver that went against every instinct drilled into them during combat operations. Weather added another layer of uncertainty. Spring storms over the North Sea could roll in quickly, bringing fog, rain, and low cloud cover that made already dangerous flights even riskier. Crews sometimes took off knowing that they might not be able to land safely at their original airfields. Alternate runways were marked out, but even these were crowded with returning aircraft. A single mistake could result in disaster. On the ground, German forces watched these flights with a mixture of resignation and disbelief. Many units were already demoralized, cut off from resupply, and awaiting orders that never came. Some German soldiers reportedly stood openly watching the bombers pass overhead, fully aware that the war was lost. The agreement to allow the flights to proceed held, not because of goodwill, but because there was nothing left to gain by stopping them. Dutch civilians quickly organized themselves around the drops. Resistance groups helped mark landing zones with white cloth, painted symbols, and bonfires when visibility was poor. Local authorities coordinated distribution once supplies hit the ground. Despite exhaustion and malnutrition, people worked together with remarkable discipline. There was little looting or violence. The understanding was clear. Survival depended on cooperation. Eyewitness accounts from Dutch civilians described scenes of raw emotion. People laughed and cried at the same time. Parents fed their children before themselves. Neighbors shared what little they caught. In some towns, church bells rang for the first time in months, despite the risk of drawing attention. For many, the sound of bomber engines became a signal of hope rather than fear. The Allied air crews noticed the change immediately. Instead of flak bursts and tracer fire, they were greeted by waving crowds, flags, and handwritten signs. Some pilots reported seeing people spell out, "Thank you," in large letters on rooftops and fields. Gunners, accustomed to scanning the skies for fighters, now leaned out of their positions just to watch the drops below. A few crews admitted that they broke formation discipline to make extra passes, ensuring supplies landed closer to populated areas. Not every mission went smoothly. Some packages burst open on impact, scattering food into mud or water. Others landed in canals or marshy ground, making recovery difficult. In rare cases, aircraft strayed too far from agreed corridors and drew nervous reactions from German units. There were close calls, moments when guns tracked aircraft but did not fire. Each flight carried tension all the way until landing. Despite these challenges, the numbers grew rapidly. By early May, thousands of tons of food had been delivered. The immediate effect was visible. Hospitals reported fewer starvation deaths. People regained enough strength to stand, walk, and work. Though the famine had done irreversible damage, especially to children and the elderly, the worst projections were averted. For Allied commanders, the success of the operations confirmed something they had long suspected but rarely witnessed so clearly. Air power could be used not only to destroy, but to stabilize and sustain. This was a new kind of victory, one that could not be measured in enemy losses or territory gained. It was measured in lives saved, in cities that survived long enough to be liberated intact. The timing was crucial. In early May 1945, German forces in the Netherlands formally surrendered. The food drops did not stop immediately. Instead, they transitioned into ground-based relief as Allied troops moved in. The bombers that had fed the population from the air gave way to trucks, trains, and ships loaded with aid. But the memory of those first flights remained powerful. For the Dutch people, the image of low-flying Allied bombers became a symbol of salvation. Long after the war, survivors would describe the sound of engines as comforting rather than terrifying. The hunger winter ended not with a dramatic battle, but with a sustained act of restraint and coordination between enemies who knew the fighting was over. For the airmen, these missions rewrote their relationship with the aircraft they flew. The same machines that had leveled cities were capable of mercy when commanded to do so. Many veterans later said that Operation Manna and Chowhound helped them reconcile their role in the war. After years of destruction, they had witnessed something undeniably good come from their work. The war in Europe was entering its final days, but these missions stood apart from victory celebrations and surrender ceremonies. They were quiet, repetitive, and deeply human. No medals were awarded on the spot. No headlines captured the full weight of what had happened. Yet in the skies over the Netherlands, something extraordinary had occurred. Bombers designed to break nations had instead sustained one. And for a brief moment, the machinery of total war served life instead of death. As May 1945 progressed, the food drops became more than an emergency response. They became a bridge between war and peace, flown in a narrow window where combat had not fully ceased, but humanity had reasserted itself. The Netherlands existed in a strange limbo. German authority was collapsing, Allied forces were advancing, and civilians were suspended between starvation and survival. The bombers kept flying because the situation on the ground demanded it. The physical effects of the famine were still everywhere. Doctors reported that even with food arriving, bodies weakened by months of deprivation could not immediately recover. People suffered from edema, infections, and organ failure triggered by sudden nourishment after prolonged starvation. Relief had to be administered carefully. The food dropped by bombers was often redistributed by medical teams who understood the risks of overfeeding. Survival was no longer just about calories. It was about control and patience. American and British planners adjusted their approach daily. Drop zones were refined. Flight paths were tightened. Coordination with Dutch officials improved as communications reopened. What had begun as a gamble turned into a tightly managed operation, proving that air power could be integrated with humanitarian logistics under extreme conditions. This was a lesson that would echo long after the war ended. For the bomber crews, repetition replaced novelty. The emotional shock of the first drops faded, replaced by quiet determination. Crews flew their missions with the same discipline they had applied to combat sorties, but the atmosphere was different. There were fewer jokes on intercoms, fewer bravado-filled conversations. Many airmen later described a sense of reverence during these flights, an unspoken understanding that what they were doing mattered in a way bombing never could. German soldiers on the ground were now openly surrendering or abandoning positions. Some assisted in directing civilians away from danger zones during drops. Others simply watched, powerless and exhausted. The Luftwaffe no longer contested the skies. The once feared German air defenses stood silent, not because they were ordered to, but because they no longer functioned as a coordinated force. The Dutch resistance, which had operated in shadows for years, emerged into the open. They helped maintain order at drop zones, prevented hoarding, and ensured fair distribution. Their role was critical. Without organization, the drops could have devolved into chaos. Instead, discipline held, even among people who had not eaten properly in months. This restraint impressed Allied observers and reinforced the belief that the Netherlands could stabilize quickly once liberated. Civilians began to keep mementos from the drops. Pieces of cloth from parachutes were saved and later turned into clothing. Some kept packaging with English writing as proof that help had come from the sky. Children remembered the shape of the bombers and the sound of their engines long after the war. These memories were not abstract symbols. They were deeply personal markers of survival. The psychological transformation was profound. For years, aircraft overhead had meant danger. Sirens, explosions, death. Now the same silhouettes brought relief. This reversal rewired fear into hope. Survivors later said that even decades after the war, the sound of low-flying planes could trigger both memories at once. Terror and gratitude intertwined. As liberation forces moved closer, Allied leaders faced a new concern: preventing civilian reprisals against retreating German troops. The famine had bred anger alongside suffering. Dutch authorities, supported by resistance leaders, worked to restrain violence. The presence of food helped. Starvation had pushed people to the edge. Relief pulled them back. Operation Manna officially ended in early May, while Operation Chowhound continued briefly until ground supply lines were fully established. In total, thousands of sorties delivered thousands of tons of food. The exact numbers mattered less than the outcome. A catastrophe had been slowed, if not entirely prevented. Tens of thousands of lives were likely saved. When Allied troops finally entered western Dutch cities, they encountered a population that was battered but alive. Relief trucks replaced bombers. Warehouses reopened. Kitchens resumed operation. But the memory of food falling from the sky remained central to how the end of occupation was remembered. For many Allied commanders, the operation stood as a quiet success amid the chaos of war's end. It had not shortened the war or destroyed enemy forces, but it had preserved the very people the war was supposedly being fought for. In internal reports, officers noted the morale impact of the drops, not just on civilians, but on Allied personnel themselves. After years of violence, this was a mission that aligned action with purpose. The bombers returned to their bases changed by the experience. Some aircraft would soon be scrapped. Others redeployed to the Pacific. Crews dispersed, reassigned, or demobilized. But among those who flew over the Netherlands, there was a shared understanding that they had witnessed something rare. War had paused long enough for mercy to take flight. Strategic bombing. They showed that air power was not inherently destructive, but defined by intent. The same engineering that produced devastation could also deliver salvation. As Europe celebrated victory, attention shifted elsewhere. The Pacific War raged on. Atomic weapons loomed. The moment when bombers dropped food instead of bombs slipped quietly into history, overshadowed by larger events. Yet for those on the ground, it remained unforgettable. Years later, Dutch survivors would gather at commemorations, watching modern aircraft fly overhead in tribute. Some brought photographs, others carried stories passed down through families. The bombers were no longer there, but their legacy remained etched into collective memory. The war had ended for the Netherlands not with a final explosion, but with sacks of flour hitting the earth and people rushing forward, not in fear, but in hope. Survival statistics, but in how the war itself was remembered by those who lived through it. For civilians who had endured years of occupation, forced labor, executions, and hunger, the sudden appearance of Allied bombers delivering food created a defining emotional breakpoint. The war did not simply end, it transformed. Medical authorities across the Western Netherlands began documenting recovery patterns. Starvation-related illnesses did not disappear overnight. Many survivors remained weak for months. Children born during the hunger winter suffered long-term developmental issues. Adults experienced chronic health problems linked directly to prolonged malnutrition. Yet without Operation Manna and Chowhound, these effects would have been far worse. Relief doctors later concluded that tens of thousands more would likely have died had the famine continued even a few weeks longer. For Allied planners, the operation became a case study almost immediately. Military journals and post-war analyses examined how strategic bombing forces had been repurposed in days to perform mass humanitarian airlift under enemy oversight. This was not disaster relief as it would later be understood. It was relief flown through an active war zone under negotiated restraint. The fact that it worked reshaped thinking about air power in the post-war world. German units varied. Some soldiers complied quietly. Others resented the ceasefire, viewing it as a humiliation. A handful of isolated incidents occurred where nervous anti-aircraft crews nearly opened fire before being stopped by officers. Each flight carried risk, even in the final days of the war. Bomber crews were briefed repeatedly on what would happen if a plane was shot down. There would be no rescue, no retaliation. The truce was fragile and unofficial. Crews accepted this reality without protest. Many later said that this was the first time they flew not because they were ordered to destroy something, but because they believed in what the mission represented. The relationship between aircrew and civilians created moments rarely seen in warfare. Dutch citizens climbed rooftops not to spot incoming danger, but to watch the bombers pass overhead. Children learned to identify aircraft types by sound and shape. The silhouettes of Lancasters and B-17s became symbols of survival rather than fear. This reversal was so powerful that many survivors later described it as the moment they knew the war was truly ending. As Allied ground forces advanced, they found cities weakened but orderly. There was no mass breakdown of civil authority. Despite extreme deprivation, Dutch communities had maintained social cohesion. Historians later credited this resilience partly to the belief that help would eventually come. Operation Manna validated that belief. No longer believed they would die unseen. The world had noticed them again. For the British and American Air Forces, the operations offered a rare moment of moral clarity. Strategic bombing had always been controversial, even during the war. Crews understood that civilians were dying beneath their flight paths. Many struggled privately with this reality. The food drops did not erase that burden, but they balanced it. Veterans later said that when they thought about their service, Operation Manna stood apart as something unquestionably right. The operation also influenced how post-war Europe viewed the Allies. Liberation was not only achieved through tanks and infantry, but through mercy delivered from the air. Dutch gratitude toward Allied forces endured for generations. Annual commemorations featured flyovers, wreaths, and personal testimonies. The bombers became woven into national memory. Politically, the operation strengthened Allied unity in the closing weeks of the war. British and American forces coordinated seamlessly. Differences in doctrine vanished in the face of urgency. This cooperation would later be cited during the formation of NATO as evidence of effective joint action. As May turned into June, relief efforts transitioned fully to ground-based supply. Roads reopened. Ports resumed operation. The bombers were no longer needed. Their job was finished. Quietly, without ceremony, they returned to their original purpose or were reassigned elsewhere. Yet the legacy lingered. Journalists who entered the Netherlands after liberation wrote not just about victory, but about planes that brought bread instead of bombs. Photographs circulated worldwide. The story resonated because it contradicted expectations. War had produced an act of restraint, not escalation. In the years that followed, Operation Manna was studied by military planners, humanitarian organizations, and historians alike. It became an early reference point for modern humanitarian airlift doctrine. The idea that overwhelming force could be redirected toward relief without undermining military authority took root here. For those who lived through it, analysis mattered less than memory. Survivors remembered faces pressed to windows, crowds running into fields, hands raised not in surrender, but in gratitude. They remembered the moment hunger loosened its grip, even if only slightly. The bombers had not ended the war. They had not liberated cities. But they had carried life into a place where death had been certain. And in doing so, they changed what the end of war looked like. Victory celebrations were muted by exhaustion and mourning. Entire families had been lost to hunger before liberation arrived. Cemeteries filled with those who had survived occupation only to succumb in its final months. Yet amid the grief, there was an enduring memory that reshaped how the war itself was understood. The moment when bombers came not to destroy, but to save. In the immediate post-war years, Dutch officials conducted extensive reviews of the famine and relief efforts. Their findings confirmed what civilians already knew intuitively. Without the airdrops, the death toll would have risen catastrophically. Rail systems had been destroyed, waterways were blocked, and German forces had stripped the land bare. There had been no realistic alternative. Air power had become the last thread holding millions to life. For Allied airmen returning home, the food drops became a defining memory that often eclipsed combat missions. Many struggled to explain it to families who expected stories of explosions and dogfights. Instead, they spoke of flying low over cities, seeing faces clearly for the first time, watching people wave instead of scatter. Veterans later said it was the only mission where they truly felt seen by the people below. Some crews received letters years later from Dutch families who had survived because of the drops. Children born after the war grew up hearing stories of food falling from the sky. Schools taught the operation as part of national history, not as a footnote, but as a turning point where survival was reclaimed at the brink of extinction. And stood beneath them, reading plaques that described their dual legacy, machines capable of devastation, yet also of mercy. Historians have since debated how Operation Manna and Chowhound should be classified. Were they military operations, humanitarian interventions, or diplomatic gestures? The truth is they were all three at once. They existed in a space where war rules bent without fully breaking, where enemies paused not out of kindness, but recognition that further suffering served no purpose. The operations also forced a reckoning with the moral dimensions of strategic bombing. They did not erase the destruction that had come before, but they complicated the narrative. Air power was no longer a single story of annihilation. It had proven adaptable, capable of restraint, capable of compassion when guided by intent. As decades passed, survivors aged, and first-hand witnesses dwindled. Yet commemorations continued. On anniversaries, modern aircraft flew ceremonial routes. Crowds gathered not to protest noise, but to remember engines that once carried hope. Veterans were honored alongside civilians. The story endured because it resisted simplification. War is often remembered through its violence. Battles, casualties, victories. But in the Netherlands, the end of World War II is also remembered through falling food, open bomb bays, and pilots trusting that guns below would stay silent. It is remembered through the sound of engines that once signaled death, now bringing life. The bombers did not change the outcome of the war. That had already been decided. What they changed was how the war ended for millions of people. Instead of famine stretching into peace, relief arrived before the guns fell silent. When bombers dropped food instead of bombs, they revealed a truth often buried beneath history's noise. Even in total war, humanity could still break through the clouds.